Some divers describe it as horizontal skydiving. Others say flying. And still others call it riding nature's diver propulsion vehicle. But you can't really compare drift diving to anything because nothing else compares. In drift diving, you cover far more area, expending far less energy than in any other form of diving, often outpacing even the hottest scooters. Only by drift diving can you zoom over the reef with the speed and ease of a barracuda. If you've never tried it, you may not be familiar with what drift diving is exactly. Drift diving is generally defined as diving in which you ride a mild to heavy current to an exit point, considerably downstream from your entry point. This differs significantly from dives in which you use lines and techniques to move against the current. While you typically think of drift diving with respect to currents in the ocean, you can also drift dive in rivers, bays, and other places with currents. Drift diving has 4 advantages. The first is that it saves energy because you don't swim much, if at all, during the tour portion of the dive. The second advantage is that drift diving opens the door to diving sites that would otherwise be hazardous or impossible due to strong current. A third one is that in drift diving, you cover a lot more ground and see a lot more of the reef than you do on non-drift dives. Finally, many types of drift dives simplify navigation because you don't have to find a particular exit point. You end the dive, surface, and the boat's there to pick you up. Besides diving advantages, drift diving has an environmental benefit because in most drift diving situations, the boat never anchors. Although dive boats are very careful to anchor in insensitive bottoms, this reduces the risk of reef damage in areas without permanent moorings. Drift diving has some concerns, which you'll learn to address during the PADI Drift Diver course. The first is drift diving often requires close coordination among other divers during entries, exits, descents, and ascents. The second is that drift diving requires extra care to stay with your buddy because the current can separate you quickly if either of you stops for some reason. A third issue is that drift diving commonly requires some form of surface supervision and support. Finally, drift dives usually require extended dive sites like a reef or wall that you tour with the current. Small local sites are hard to drift dive, though in some places you may drift to a specific spot like a wreck, explore it, then drift after you start your ascent. In these cases, the dive begins and ends as a drift dive, but the tour isn't a drift dive. All drift diving takes place in currents, but there are different drift dive environments related to different types of currents. Longshore currents result when waves strike the coast at an angle, creating a flow parallel to shore. The bigger the waves, the stronger the current. Longshore currents aren't commonly used for drift diving, but sometimes divers drift dive them from shore by entering the water and exiting down the coast to either walk or drive back. Offshore currents are the ones you normally associate with drift diving. They're large, permanent currents caused by the Earth's rotation. In some places, they may vary in strength, but in places popular for drift diving, they're reliably strong and continuous. Tidal currents result from the daily rise and fall of the tides. Tidal currents alternate direction with little or no current when the tides change. Drift diving tidal currents is most common where there's a pronounced variation in tidal heights and a relatively contained area like a bay to create a strong water flow. River currents are caused by water flowing downhill to the sea and by the Earth's rotation. Drift diving in rivers is usually from shore, though it may be from a boat, especially in large rivers. Regardless of their origin, currents have similar characteristics when you dive in them. One of these is that the current flows faster near the surface than near the bottom. So if you must swim against the current, generally the bottom's the best place to go because it's slower there. Try to duck behind rocks, reef, or other shelter to get out of the flow as much as possible. In drift diving, moving against the current should be an exception, not the rule. Fighting currents can cause overexertion. Although there are many variations of each, there are three basic types of drift diving. Drift diving with a surface float, without a surface float, and with a delay surface marker buoy. When drift diving with a surface float, you drift along under a towed buoy that shows your location so the boat can follow you easily. This is a good technique for when choppy conditions may make it hard to follow bubbles, and it's good for beginning drift divers because the line provides a vertical reference for descents and ascents. When drift diving without a surface float, you stay as a group and the boat tracks your bubbles. This can be more difficult for boat personnel, and you need adequate visibility for the group to stay together. But it's common where obstacles might hang up a tow line. It's also common in deep drift diving to avoid having the float in shallower, faster water drag the line handler. Drift diving with a delayed surface marker buoy, or DSMB, combines the previous techniques. You begin the dive as a floatless drift dive. When it's time to go up, the leader inflates and sends up a DSMB, and everyone ascends along the line. This technique gives the advantages of descending and touring without a line, while making it easier for the boat to spot your location when you come up. It also helps alert boat traffic that you're there. Regardless of which type of drift dive you make, surface supervision is generally recommended even when it's not required by logistics. Having someone at the surface helps warn away boat traffic, provides assistance if someone has a problem, and simplifies the dive, picking everyone up at the end. Supervisors on shore-based drift dives can drop off divers at the entry point and then pick them up at the exit point. Like all dive specialties, drift diving has some equipment considerations, starting with the types of floats. There are many types used in drift diving, but among them, large spherical boat fenders are popular because they're readily available, highly visible, and the larger ones have ample buoyancy to support 2 or 3 divers pulling against it while ascending. However, because they're big, they're harder to tow. DSMBs are typically tall, sausage-shaped buoys, open at one end so you can inflate it underwater. Though some divers use large, brightly colored lift bags. The primary advantage of these is that you don't have to tow your float until you need it. One drawback is that sausage-style DSMBs will get pulled under if divers pull too hard against it, so the line must be used only as a visual reference. Conventional flag and float buoys are a common option, especially where boat traffic's an issue. Large ones have ample buoyancy, though small, compact styles go under easily if divers pull too hard against them. But they're very easy to tow because of their small size. To avoid entanglement, you always need a line caddy or reel to control the tow line. For general drift diving with a float, a line caddy with medium nylon or polypropylene line works well. You usually use a tech reel with finer braided line with DSMBs, and some divers prefer these for regular floats too. This finer line makes an effective visual reference. The rule of thumb is to have at least twice as much line as your intended depth. This gives you extra if you go deeper than planned, and to allow the buoy to drift slightly ahead of the group in the faster surface current. As you probably recall from your PADI open water diver course, surface signaling devices should be a standard part of your kit. This is especially true in drift diving in case you need to get the boat's attention for pickup. Carry at least one visual device, such as an inflatable signal tube, signal mirror or light, and one audible device like a whistle or low-pressure horn. You may also need to choose a boat suitable for drift diving. Actually, provided they're suitable for the conditions and number of divers, many vessels ranging from large cabin cruisers and liveaboards to small inflatables and skiffs can adequately support drift diving. Generally, the most important criterion is the ability for all divers to enter and exit the water relatively quickly together. This is important because most types of drift diving require the group to begin the dive together, and often stay and end it together too. Sometimes it's not the boat, but the boat operator you need to choose for drift diving. You want an operator who's familiar and ideally experienced with drift diving procedures. This is particularly important because drift diving frequently involves live boating. Live boating means the vessel isn't anchored but under power with propellers engaged while divers are in the water. The captain must know when to engage and disengage the propellers to avoid endangering divers. The deck crew also needs to be familiar with drift diving procedures because they provide support and help relay communications between the divers and the boat operator. Now let's look at the techniques you use while drift diving. There are many variations depending upon the boat and environment, but the techniques discussed here generally apply, and you may mix and match them at times. As you'd expect, you start with drift dive planning considerations. These include surface conditions and current intensity, and depth and visibility, both of which affect the drift dive technique you'll use. The dive objective may influence technique and the dive team choice. The number and size of the team influences the techniques you use, as can diver experience levels. As mentioned earlier, bottom topography can affect towing afloat, and the availability of surface support may determine how you drift dive, or even whether you can drift dive at all. Interestingly, drift dive navigation isn't often a major planning issue because typically you don't navigate. You ride the current, surface, and the boat picks you up. There are some exceptions, of course, with shore drift diving being the main one. You may need to navigate so that you don't miss your exit point. If there's nothing underwater that alerts you to it, or you're not familiar with the area, the usual procedure is to surface early enough to spot the exit. You may leave something like a brightly colored towel if the location's not otherwise obvious. After planning, in preparing for a drift dive entry, the most important factor is that everyone is ready to enter together. When everyone's ready, depending upon the boat's configuration, you'll either enter at once or rapidly one after the other. The crew coordinates the divers with the captain. Never enter the water until cleared to do so by the captain or crew. This is important because the boat must be in the right place and, more importantly, so the propellers are disengaged. Drift diving involves two primary entry techniques. For buoyant entries, you enter the water with your BCD partially inflated. Everyone assembles together and descends at the leader's signal. This is a common technique with relatively inexperienced drift divers, and it allows you to sort out final problems at the surface. But it requires a site where some delay before descending isn't an issue. With negative entries, you enter with your BCD deflated and descend without stopping at the surface. This is a common technique when you need to start the drift at a specific point, and it's also popular when surface conditions are rough. It does, however, require that all divers have sufficient experience to descend and equalize fairly rapidly so the group stays together. Now let's look at some of the variations on both buoyant and negative drift diving entries. You may learn or practice some that differ, but these are some of the most popular methods. In a buoyant entry with a surface float, the dive begins with the float trailing behind the boat, much like a current line when you're not drift diving. When everyone's ready, on the captain's signal, everyone enters and assembles along the line. The line handler disconnects the line and starts down, with everyone following along the line. The line handler levels off at the planned depth, and everyone drifts together. In a negative entry with a surface float, after everyone's ready and cleared to go by the captain, the line handler enters first with everyone right behind. The line handler descends immediately, feeding outline, with the group following the line. Everyone levels off at the planned depth for the drift. Entries without a float, or that will use a DSMB, are usually negative entries. Everyone follows the guide into the water at the captain's signal and descends immediately. To stay together, it's important that everyone descends at the same time and keep the guide in sight. The guide levels the group off at the planned depth and everyone drifts together.